When we think about the historical process, typically we think of historians looking through books and archives, primary sources, libraries, things like this, using the evidence to come to conclusions about what happened in the past. But sometimes there's hidden history, ordinary interactions that shed light where many academics don't go or don't bother to go. I call this type of history informal history or anecdotal history. It's similar to oral history in a way because you're getting the perspective and the viewpoint of ordinary people in a way that is often ignored by the more traditional historical pursuits. But in other ways, it's a lot less rigorous than a traditional oral history that's done well. But anecdotal or informal history includes interactions, relationships, memories, stories that say more than they might seem to at first. Anecdotal history is not necessarily scientific. We refer to history as a social science, and for good reason. There's this social element to it, sort of the humanities element of it, involving stories and tradition and cultures, but there's also the science element of it, where it's about looking at evidence, looking at data, analytics, statistics, anything that a historian can get their hands on to provide evidence for an argument. I think that as time has gone on, the science element of it has become more popular and the social element of it has become sort of frowned upon. Efforts to make history into more of a science seem to be more and more common these days. But I would caution against this way of thinking, and I think that both elements of that social science dichotomy, the social part and the science part, can be useful in their own ways. In my view, anecdotal history is not always scientific, but it adds color, it can fill in the gaps, and it adds clarity and meaning, personality, and understanding in ways that other types of history can't do. As I've mentioned in the previous 2 episodes of this series, we've been looking at a book called China Tripping. It includes a lot of this anecdotal history, specifically as it relates to China and sort of the history of Westerners traveling in China and learning things about the culture and about the history. The editors of the book sort of describe their mission here. They say, quote, "Instead of looking for formal and lengthy autobiographies and memoirs, we looked for short, in-and-out vignettes and reflections. What follows are adventures of discovery and self-discovery. Some accounts are charming, some are funny, some are sad. Stereotypes of all sorts dissolve. Deep human friendships are made. Meanwhile, China itself is seen changing and evolving at breakneck pace. We authors have dedicated much of our lives to the study of China and the cultural bridge-building efforts that became our classroom lectures and our published writings. Furthermore, if there is indeed a common theme in this collection, perhaps it is that of the author's wonder and discovery, and also, by implication, the theme of the author's ignorance that preceded that new experience and understanding. Our group of trippers is diverse. It includes women and men, various disciplinary researchers, people from differing ethnic backgrounds, as well as older, middle-aged, and younger trippers. Our trippers have tried very hard not to be preachy or hit the reader over the head with the only possible meaning of their vignettes. We believe that each reflection contains various takeaways for readers, but you, the reader, can decide for yourself what the takeaways are. Over the decades, whenever China trippers met, they told stories about things they experienced during their latest adventures, but rarely, if ever, wrote up their random personal encounters." End quote. The idea of the book and the idea of what I'm calling anecdotal history is not necessarily to be using these stories to draw grand sweeping conclusions about historical events. Again, it's more about the personal element of history. It's about filling in some of the gaps. It's about providing color and humanity to our understanding of history. Anecdotal history can be a way to get the ball rolling, to foster intellectual and cultural diffusion, to create connections for future generations, and it requires a certain type of approach. It requires open-mindedness, it requires interaction with the unfamiliar, it requires the ability to be uncomfortable and understanding that you might not know everything and it's possible to learn from other people, however ordinary they might seem. And what really struck me as I was reading the book was that this anecdotal approach, while more personal and not necessarily about drawing historical conclusions, the people who followed this approach, the historians that sort of embraced this, ended up going on avenues that would lead to sort of proper historical research and being able to do history as the way we think history should be done, with data and evidence and all of these types of things, relying on more than just personal stories. A great example of this comes from historian Jeremy Brown, who was in China looking through the archives trying to find information on his historical topic, which was about rural and urban China and how people were moving both ways and in both directions there. He says that as he was looking through the archives and as he was talking to the officials who were providing him with documents and things like this, that he was just getting boring statistical reports that were not helping him from a historical perspective. So he wasn't getting the documents and the information he was going to need to produce the historical work that he wanted to do. He says, quote, "My dissertation research was a disaster. Desperate, I started spending less time at the archive and more time at the flea market, where a tight-knit group of middle-aged men who had been laid off as factory workers or truck drivers made a meager living selling used books and discarded documents. Highly literate and deeply cynical, the peddlers squatted on low wooden stools, smoking cheap cigarettes and talking up their wares. They welcomed me into their world. Where the official archive staff had been stiff and recalcitrant, the document peddlers went out of their way to be helpful, trying to explain my project to one another and actively acquiring files they thought I might want to buy." End quote. Brown goes on to say that the relationships he developed with these document peddlers and these sort of flea market used book salesmen ended up giving him what he needed to produce an incredible amount of historical production. He says, quote, "2 of my dissertation chapters grew directly out of my interaction with Wang, Mu, and other peddlers. If I had stayed put in the archive, I never would have learned about how city officials had directed and funded the deportation of political enemies from Tianjin to villages during the Cultural Revolution. The peddlers, who knew that I was looking for anything related to city people going to the countryside, introduced me to files dealing with individual deportees as well as official policy documents. They also talked about their own experience during the 1970s. End quote. I like this story because it demonstrates that there's different stories being told by the same entities in many cases. For example, in that story, the public story that the Chinese party is telling is in the archives, and that's where they want him to look. But more of the private, more of the personal, more of the real story is out there. You just have to go and interact with people and find ways to get at that underground style of history. In the same way that Jeremy Brown in that story was showing how China has this identity crisis of public versus private, the more you get into anecdotal history, you begin to understand that that identity crisis of public versus private also applies to individual people, individual Chinese citizens, and sometimes even the individual Westerners who were developing these relationships in China. themes of identity and what makes a person who they are prevalent throughout this book. And it shows the reality that there's always hidden meanings inside of historical events, ordinary people involved with historical events. And in the same way that a good oral history will amplify this, anecdotal history teaches you how to listen to the silences between the words, the meaning underneath the surface. Sometimes anecdotal history requires more than just learning about somebody else. Sometimes it requires experiencing the same things that they experienced in some way or another. Sometimes you need to be an outsider to be an insider. To understand the misfits of a society, maybe you might have to be one as well. Vera Schwartz talks about being an American student in China in the late 1970s. The rest of her cohort was living in sort of a communal dormitory room, and Vera decided that she wanted to live in a individual dorm room, a single room. This was seen by many as an act of rebellion, and it ostracized her from the group in a lot of ways and made her feel like an outsider. But what Vera began to realize was that many of her Chinese comrades began to use her room as a sanctuary of sorts to get away from the group. So many people would come into her room sort of for one-on-one interactions, and Vera was able to use this to develop personal relationships and learn more about different elements of Chinese society. Some people simply weren't comfortable sharing in front of a larger group, but they were more comfortable in the individual setting. Vera's act of rebellion in taking a single room away from the group led to a development of personalizing and relationships and meeting people and developing how to do oral history. It's here that she says she learned to listen to the silence between the words, something that's crucial for any oral historian. She says, quote, "I managed to listen more and more to silences, to what lay between words. When I moved into the dormitory, I had no idea that I would be doing oral history for the next 2 decades. I could not have imagined all the doors for interviews that would open in the late 1980s. By that time, I had left my snug single room in the dilapidated dormitory and was now hosted in the new guest center. But looking back, I see that it all started with a risky choice. Not jumping into the inside of Chinese social life with a roommate, I ended up choosing otherness, outsiderness. This enabled me to listen in a different way to Chinese voices and to my own as a writer in a language far from my native tongue. Only in China, only at Peking University, did I finally understand the meaning of the overused poem by Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Sometimes you have to travel far to see your own world afresh." End quote. An example there of the strange ways that identity can be developed over time through decisions that might seem like they hurt you at the time, but in the long run end up changing who you are as a person for the better. As we talked about earlier, identity is a big theme of the book. And in this particular case, Vera Schwartz developed sort of an outsider identity that would help her develop her historical style for decades to come. So the interactions of a Westerner in China had huge ramifications for the personal development and the identity and future history of that particular person in this case, but it also goes the other way. And you can see the struggle for identity between public and private personas that Chinese people were going through. What makes it interesting for me is this identity struggle of public versus private personas is especially poignant in China. Everybody goes through questions of identity. Everybody wonders, who am I? This is something that is part of being human. But what makes it interesting in China is that not everyone's battle is life or death like it is for many in China. Believing one thing in private about yourself and then expressing that belief in public could lead to horrible consequences and horrible disasters. And if you need evidence of that, just look at the Cultural Revolution. There's a slew of evidence that shows expressing the wrong thing in public could get you killed. Historian Paul Pickowitz describes his personal party scene in Beijing in the early 1980s. He says that one time he went up to a high-rise apartment where he was told a party was. He walks in the door. He sees a whole bunch of working-class women who show up in working garb. They quickly go into the back room, get changed, and they come out looking glamorous in dance attire, and seemingly a total fashion and personality transformation has occurred behind the closed door. From there, the windows were blocked, the neighbors were alerted not to call the police, and a Michael Scott-style cafe disco dance party ensued, with Western music and dancing and fun being had. Pickowitz describes what he was thinking towards the end of the party, quote, "Still, everyone had great fun all the way until 3 or 4 in the morning. Then, one by one, the women retreated to the back room, removed the makeup, removed the gorgeous clothing, readjusted hairstyles, and reappeared in their work clothes before saying goodbye and heading for the early morning streets. In their heart of hearts, I wondered, what were these young people really like? More like their public space personas or more like their private space personas?" End quote. Public or private? Who is the real you? Can a person have different personas, different identities in different situations? Or are we always the same? Are we the same person underneath, no matter where we are? Interesting historical questions to think about, interesting psychological questions to think about. And as we said before, the reality is that everybody goes through these situations, these questions, no matter if you're Chinese or American or some other nationality. And that's another theme that this book gets at, is a common humanity. Despite different customs, different cultures, different understandings of the world, stories of traveling in China like this demonstrate that there is this common humanity that people can share and find ways to live with each other and learn with each other, even under the most stressful circumstances. No recollection or story in this book does a better job of showing this, in my opinion, than historian Morris Rosabi, whose tale is called Death of a Tourist. This is one of my personal favorites in the book, and it goes like this. Morris Rosabi is leading a travel group that's traveling through China in 1979. So you have to keep in mind that this is at a time period where there's not a lot of Western travelers in China just yet. So this is a new experience for the group. It's a new experience for the Chinese Communist Party, who are trying to show these people around while also not showing them anything that could damage the party. But eventually, one of the gentlemen in Rosabi's travel group begins to complain of a cough. He seems to be getting sick, and he begins to start saying that he really wants to go home at this point. He's done with the trip. Now, keep in mind, this is Communist China in 1979, so unexpected exits from the trip might make the CCP nervous. So the travel leader, Rosabi, now has to sort of wade through the bureaucracy to get permission to allow this guy to go fly home because he's sick. In asking for permission from the Chinese Communist Party, Rosabi has inadvertently gotten the bureaucratic machine rolling. And there's sort of this comical, efficient inefficiency from the Chinese Communist Party where he's trying to wade through all these levels of bureaucracy and nothing's getting done. And eventually the guy who was sick ends up dying. So now things are really getting weird. Razabi is now flying around the country trying to make calls and arrangements to the family of the deceased. He's also trying to figure out how he can bring the body overseas if he even wants to do that. The Chinese end up doing an autopsy of the body. They find some radioactive pellets in his body, presumably as some sort of treatment for illness. But they don't know that, and they're wondering why a radioactive dude is running around China, so they're freaking out. And as you can probably guess, the traveling trip is ruined. Now, the Chinese Communist Party also doesn't want Americans to think that somebody died under their watch, so in some ways they're going out of their way to make sure that the rest of the traveling group is now well accounted for and happy and understands that this wasn't something that the Communist Party did, this was just a freak accident. So Razabi gets told they're going to have a funeral in China for this deceased guy. It's going to be attended by some of the top officials in the Chinese Communist Party, and Razabi is giving the eulogy at the funeral. So he has to now write a speech for somebody he probably didn't even know, other than just saying a few things and directing him in his travels. He gets to the funeral. The Chinese Communist Party has rolled out the red carpet. People are given special armbands to wear. It's being held in a special memorial hall. The authorities, who needed a picture for the atrium in front of the funeral hall, decided that not having any other picture of the guy, they were just going to blow up his passport photo, which did not look good. So they blow up this huge passport photo. They place it right in front of the memorial hall. And Razabi gives a speech eulogizing someone that he does not know personally. Quote, "Over the past few days, I have wondered why Mr. X came to China. Knowing that he was gravely ill, what prompted him to go so far away from his home? We shall, of course, never know. I suggest that, like Mr. X, we wish to transcend our ordinary lives. In our homes, the humdrum, the petty ensnare us. We worry about the grocery bills, our children's education, our possessions. Travel liberates us, detaches us from our possessions, enables us to extend our vision. I believe this is what Mr. X must have cherished. He sought to expose himself to universal concerns and was not simply interested in his own small corner of the world. He was eager, on this trip, to find out about traditional China and the transformations that have been wrought over the past 30 years. Last Wednesday, he told me how much he had been impressed by the magnificent architectural monuments we had seen, and at the same time, by the concern and kindness we had been accorded by our Chinese hosts. Mr. X was happy throughout his stay in China because he had achieved his lifelong dream. Thus, though his death is a source of great sorrow for his family, for our group, and for our Chinese hosts, we should take heart that he himself was happy during his last days. I think that Mr. X would be pleased that he reached China on the verge of the initiation of diplomatic relations between our two countries, and I believe that he would join with us in hoping for peace and friendship between Americans and Chinese for 10,000 years and more." End quote. So you have this inefficient efficiency from the Communist Party where they are making these funeral arrangements that probably didn't need to be made. They're making people give speeches that probably didn't need to be made. And now he's in a position where he has to give the speech and eulogize this person while also making the Chinese Communist Party happy. And I think Razabi there does a good job of making the best of a weird situation. You have to wonder if the guy who got sick was feeling lonely and estranged in a strange country during his final days. But the way that story is told makes you also think that there's a feeling of connection and a feeling of shared humanity across different cultures. The importance of a funeral, the importance of remembering the dead, although maybe for some bizarre reasons, seems to be connected in both cultures in that particular case. Historian Philip Williams talks about losing his passport in China and having a horrible experience at sort of the Chinese version of the DMV, where the clerk behind the desk was not cooperating and she didn't seem to care that he lost his passport, and it seemed like his trip to China was going to be ruined. But rather than getting angry or creating a scene, he continued to show kindness to the clerk and eventually found a different clerk, continued his attitude of kindness, and this person was able to help him out, ultimately getting him a new passport. It seems that another element of common humanity is that kindness can go a long way. At the end of the day, the book China Tripping depicts travelers in China and the human relationships that they built with the people there and what that might mean for the broader study of history. In this series, I picked out a couple of the themes that are important to me and that I sort of got from the book, but as we quoted from the editors earlier, there's not just one lesson or two lessons or a certain type of lesson. Different readers can have different lessons from these stories, and that's part of the importance of anecdotal history and using that approach as a way to pave connections for future generations to explore.